Man gets sick of neighbours using his pool without permission, and what he did next shocked everyone. After weeks of frustration, he planned the ultimate revenge, and his bold move had the entire neighbourhood talking. "Do they think I'm running a public pool now?" Mark muttered, pressing his forehead against the kitchen window. His fingers tightened around his mug of coffee as he watched his neighbours, the Mendez family, hosting yet another unsanctioned pool party in his backyard. It was a Saturday afternoon, and while most people were out enjoying their weekend, Mark had just returned from a particularly stressful week at the accounting firm where he worked. All he wanted was some peace and quiet, maybe a lazy afternoon by the pool. Instead, Tony Mendez and his loud, carefree friends were sprawled out on his patio furniture, lounging by the water without a care in the world. It hadn't always been like this. Mark, a 42-year-old who had lived alone since his divorce 5 years ago, had been thrilled when he first bought the house in this quiet, middle-class suburban neighbourhood. It was his dream home. The wide backyard, the shade of a large oak tree in one corner, and most importantly, the sparkling blue pool. That pool had been his solace during long summer days, a place where he could unwind and leave the worries of his work behind. At first, his new neighbours had seemed friendly. The Mendez family, in particular, appeared to be the picture of suburban politeness. Tony, a mid-40s salesman with a cocky smile and an easygoing charm, had greeted Mark the day he moved in, saying, "Welcome to the neighbourhood. You've got a great place here." Mark hadn't thought much of it at the time. He wasn't looking for close friendships, just a little peace and quiet after years of living in cramped apartments. But it wasn't long before Tony's compliments turned into something else. First, it was the kids, teenagers from the neighbourhood, who would hop the low fence around his property when he wasn't home, sneaking quick swims while Mark was at work. Then it was Tony and his friends who started showing up with 6-packs of beer, acting like they were doing Mark a favour by breaking in the pool for him. Tony would always shrug off any complaint with a smile, saying, "Come on, man, what's the big deal? It's just a pool. We're neighbours." But to Mark, it was a big deal. That pool represented his hard work, his personal sanctuary, and the neighbours' constant intrusion felt like a blatant disregard for his boundaries. He tried addressing the issue politely at first, even offering to let them use the pool as long as they asked for permission in advance, but his requests were met with indifference. In fact, it seemed to get worse. Almost every weekend, he would return home to find Tony, his wife Linda, and half the neighbourhood lounging around his pool, acting like it was their own. "Mark, you got to stop letting them walk all over you like this," his co-worker Doug said one day during lunch, after Mark had vented about his frustration with his neighbours yet again. Doug, a brash and outspoken guy, wasn't one to shy away from confrontation. "You pay the mortgage, right? It's your house. You should tell them to back off. If it were me, I'd call the cops on them." Mark considered it. He really did. But calling the police on his neighbours felt like a step too far. What if things got ugly? He wasn't interested in making enemies. He just wanted to be left alone. There had to be another way to get his point across, something that didn't involve escalating the situation into a full-blown feud. It was another scorching Saturday afternoon when Mark's frustration reached a breaking point. He had just returned from a long day running errands, arms full of groceries, when he heard the unmistakable sound of laughter and splashing coming from his backyard. He groaned. Not again. Sure enough, there they were, Tony Mendez, Linda, their 2 teenage sons, and a group of friends, happily splashing around in his pool as if they'd owned the place. A portable speaker blasted music, and half-empty beer bottles littered the pool deck. Mark stood frozen in his kitchen for a moment, the grocery bag slipping from his hands as the anger rose inside him like a slow-boiling wave. He couldn't take it anymore. That night, as he sat alone in his living room, the distant sound of laughter still coming from the pool area, Mark began to plan. He didn't want a confrontation. No, he was tired of talking. He needed something more dramatic, something that would send a clear message, one they couldn't ignore. Mark was nothing if not meticulous, and that night he pored over articles online, researching pool chemicals, water maintenance, and safety procedures. He wasn't looking to harm anyone, just to create enough of a disturbance to make his pool completely unusable for a while. He learned about pH balances, chlorine levels, and something called superchlorination, which could render the water cloudy and undrinkable for days. That's when the idea hit him. A harmless prank that would make the pool look dangerous, but was, in reality, perfectly safe. The concoction he had in mind would be dramatic, thick, foamy bubbles, almost like a chemical reaction that would send any unwanted guest scrambling away in fear. He smiled to himself. It was perfect, the true ultimate revenge. The following weekend, Mark was ready. The day started like any other, with Tony and his crew showing up uninvited around noon. By now, it was a routine. Mark watched from his window as they lounged by the pool, flipping burgers on a portable grill they had dragged over without asking. As the sun began to set, Mark made his move. He casually walked out to his shed, pretending to search for something, though in reality, he was grabbing a blue bowl he had filled with a mixture of chemicals earlier that day. The concoction was harmless, but was designed to create a thick, foamy layer on the surface of the pool, making it look as though something had gone horribly wrong with the water. With the bowl in hand, Mark strolled over to the pool, not drawing attention to himself until he reached the edge. His heart raced as he tipped the bowl into the water, watching as the mixture began to spread. At first, nothing happened, but within minutes, the pool started to transform. The clear blue water became cloudy, thick bubbles foaming on the surface. Soon, steam began to rise from the water, giving the appearance of a chemical reaction. "What the hell is that?" Tony yelled, jumping up from his lounge chair, eyes wide as he watched the pool froth and churn. The guests gathered around, staring in horror at the thick white foam that was quickly covering the entire pool. Mark stepped back, arms crossed, pretending to look concerned. "Must be a chemical imbalance," he said, shaking his head. "Could be dangerous. You might want to stay out of the water for a while." Tony's face was a mix of shock and suspicion. He glanced at Mark, as if trying to figure out whether this was some sort of prank. But there was nothing he could say. The pool was obviously unusable, and there was no way he could prove Mark had done anything. The guests hurriedly gathered their belongings and left, muttering complaints as they went. Tony stood by the pool for a moment longer, glaring at the foamy water before storming off without a word. For the next week, Mark enjoyed the peace and quiet he had craved for so long. The pool remained untouched, the once blue water still clouded with the aftermath of his chemical trick. The neighbours stayed away, unsure of what exactly had happened, but wary enough to leave Mark and his pool alone. But Mark knew it wouldn't last forever. Tony wasn't the type to let something like this go easily. Sure enough, the following weekend, Tony showed up at Mark's front door, arms crossed, jaw clenched in frustration. "You did something to that pool," Tony said, his voice low, but laced with accusation. Mark kept his face neutral, pretending not to understand. "It's just pool maintenance, Tony. You know these things happen. I'm just trying to take care of my property." Tony stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to press the issue further. But what could he do? He had no proof, and there was no way to force Mark to let them use the pool again. Finally, Tony shook his head and walked away without another word. Mark watched him go, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He had won. In the weeks that followed, Mark's backyard returned to the peaceful haven it had once been. The neighbours, clearly spooked by the pool incident, stopped treating it like a community amenity. The teenagers stopped sneaking in, and Tony and his friends no longer lounged on his patio without permission. For the first time in months, Mark felt like his home was truly his again. But as time passed, he began to realize that he didn't want to be completely isolated from his neighbors. Despite the trouble Tony and his family had caused, Mark wasn't a vengeful person. He just wanted respect and boundaries. So, a month after the incident, Mark decided to extend an olive branch. He planned a small barbecue, inviting a few of the neighbors over for burgers and drinks. He made it clear that the pool was still off limits unless permission was given, but he hoped that by inviting them into his space on his own terms, they would start to understand the importance of respecting his boundaries. Surprisingly, Tony showed up. He wasn't as loud and arrogant as before. In fact, he seemed almost sheepish, offering a half-hearted apology for the way things had gotten out of hand. "Look, man," Tony said as they stood by the grill. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. We just got a little too comfortable, I guess." Mark nodded. "I get it. But it's my place. I worked hard for it, and I need you guys to respect that." Tony nodded in return, and while they weren't exactly friends, there was an understanding between them. The tension that had once filled the air between them began to fade. After that barbecue, where Mark had laid down the rules about the pool, Tony seemed to have changed. There were no more unannounced visits, no loud parties by the pool, and even the teenagers in the neighborhood had stopped sneaking in. But more than that, Tony started waving to Mark in the mornings and stopping by for casual conversations. One Saturday afternoon, Mark was in the backyard, trimming the hedges near the pool, when Tony came over to the fence with a couple of beers. "Hey, you got a minute?" Tony asked, holding out a cold bottle. Mark hesitated but then nodded. "Sure." The two men sat by the pool, sipping their drinks and making small talk. Tony opened up about how things had been tough for him lately. Work stress, trying to keep his family happy, and struggling with bills. Mark listened, realizing for the first time that Tony's laid-back, carefree attitude had been masking a lot of personal problems. For years, Mark had viewed Tony as the annoying neighbor who didn't respect his boundaries, but now, sitting there by the pool, Tony seemed more human, more vulnerable. Tony looked at the water, which was once again clear and inviting. "I didn't mean to take advantage of you, Mark. I guess I don't know. I felt like you had this great life, and I wanted to be part of it. But I didn't realize I was overstepping." Mark nodded. "I get it. But you've got to understand that this is my space. I worked for it, and I need to protect it. I'm not saying you can't ever come over, but it has to be on my terms, you know." Tony smiled sheepishly. "I understand now." "Yeah, I understand. Thanks for not calling the cops on us." The two men laughed, and for the first time, Mark felt like maybe things could change for the better. He didn't need to be best friends with Tony, but at least now there was a level of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. Just when things seemed to have settled down, Mark started to notice strange things happening around the pool again. At first, it was small stuff, little disturbances like the pool cover being slightly out of place or a few wet footprints on the patio in the morning when he was sure no one had been swimming. Mark's first thought was that the neighborhood kids were back to their old tricks, but after asking around, he learned that the Mendez boys were spending most of their summer at a camp out of town. Tony, too, had been unusually busy at work. So if it wasn't the Mendez family, who was it? One evening, Mark decided to stay up late and keep an eye on the backyard. He turned off all the lights in the house, made a cup of coffee, and sat near the back door with a view of the pool. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up and go to bed, he heard something. A splash. Mark froze. Slowly, he crept to the window and peeked outside. Under the dim moonlight, he saw a figure standing by the edge of the pool, quietly slipping into the water. Mark's heart raced. Who was this? Was it another neighbour taking advantage of his hospitality, or was it something more sinister? Mark grabbed his phone and cautiously stepped outside, turning on the patio lights as he approached the pool. "Hey, who's there?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure in the pool stopped moving, startled by the sudden light. As Mark got closer, he realized with a shock that it wasn't a teenager or an intruder at all. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, shivering in the water. "Who are you?" Mark asked, lowering his voice. The woman looked up at him, eyes wide with fear and embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know where else to go." Confused, Mark stood by the edge of the pool. "What do you mean? You can't just break into someone's yard like this." She hesitated, clearly embarrassed but desperate. I'm staying with my aunt down the street." "I didn't want to bother her, and I saw your pool. I didn't think anyone would notice." Mark sighed. "You can't just sneak into people's backyards, especially at night. It's dangerous. What's going on?" The woman explained that she had recently moved in with her aunt after leaving an abusive relationship. She didn't have many friends or places to go, and she had seen the pool as an escape, a place where she could clear her head. She didn't mean to intrude, but she didn't know where else to turn. Mark found himself in an unexpected dilemma. On one hand, he couldn't just let people keep using his pool without permission. On the other hand, this young woman seemed genuinely lost and in need of help. His first instinct was to tell her to leave and never come back, but something stopped him. "I get it," he said after a long pause, "but you can't keep sneaking in here. If you need a place to clear your head, just ask. I'm not a monster. I let you use the pool if I'm around." The woman's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you. I won't be a bother, I promise." From that day on, Mark would occasionally spot her coming over in the afternoons. She always asked permission first, and she was careful to leave the pool area exactly as she found it. Slowly, Mark realized that his pool had become more than just his sanctuary. It had become a place of refuge for others too. He began to see that maybe, just maybe, his obsession with keeping the pool entirely to himself had been a little too rigid. He didn't regret setting boundaries, but perhaps there was room to be a little more open-hearted when it came to those in need. Just when Mark thought everything had finally settled down, a new surprise arose. One evening, while he was grilling in his backyard, he noticed a flyer stuck to his front door. It was from the local homeowners association, announcing a community meeting about a new initiative, a public pool project. Mark's stomach dropped as he read the details. Apparently, several neighbours had petitioned to have a public pool built nearby. They argued that the community needed a shared space for summer activities, and that residents shouldn't have to travel to the next town just to enjoy some water during the hot months. As he continued reading, Mark realized that the petition had been led by none other than Tony Mendez. Furious, Mark stormed over to Tony's house, flyer in hand. "What is this?" he demanded. Tony shrugged, clearly unfazed. "It's just a community project, Mark. You've got your own pool, so I didn't think you'd care." "Of course I care. You think this is going to fix things? People will still come to my pool, even if there's a public one down the street." Tony sighed, as if all this were a misunderstanding. "Come on, man, the public pool will take the pressure off you. Nobody will need to use yours anymore. Isn't that what you want?" Mark stood there, speechless. He had spent so much time fighting to keep his pool private, and now Tony was suggesting that a public pool would somehow make his life easier. But as Mark thought about it, he realized Tony might be right. Maybe a public pool would keep the kids and neighbours from feeling entitled to his property. Maybe it would create a better balance. He didn't like the idea at first, but the more he considered it, the more he thought it might not be so bad after all. The public pool project took months to get approved, but when it finally did, Mark felt an unexpected sense of relief. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was something. Over the next year, as construction began on the new community pool, Mark noticed fewer and fewer disturbances at his home. The teenagers stopped coming around, and Tony's family became less interested in hanging out by his pool. By the time the public pool opened, Mark's backyard had truly become his own private oasis again. Occasionally, he would invite the young woman from down the street or a few close friends over for a swim, but the days of loud parties and uninvited guests were over. Mark had won back his peace, but he had also learned something along the way. Sometimes, protecting what's yours requires setting boundaries, but other times, it's about finding ways to share with the right people on your own terms. Mark found a balance between privacy and community, and for the first time in years, he could truly relax, knowing that his pool and his life were finally under control.